Thank you for joining us today. COVID and how to prepare, what we've learned, and what are the opportunities. Wow, what a challenge. I thought I would start out by at least suggesting one solution. And then what I want to do is turn it over to Vanessa. She's been speaking a lot on the topic and has some materials to share. And then I think we're both going to come up with a shopping list of ideas and opportunities and challenges. But from the lighter side, I thought I would start with what I'm calling my COVID preparatory kit. So it's not very complicated, but back in January, February, when we first started to hear the news about COVID, preparation number one was making sure we had enough food. Not a brilliant solution, but everybody began to laugh at me when I was stocking the refrigerator and the pantry with all this extra food. And guess what? In the February and March timeframe, when they were all standing in line at the supermarkets, waiting to buy the few scarce supplies that were left, suddenly nobody was laughing. So with that as the macro, to be prepared at the most fundamental level, let me turn it over to Vanessa, who will give some overview and background and set the stage. Vanessa.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm very pleased to be here today and to be speaking with all of you. I think this is a critical time, a critical topic, and something that many of us have been working to prepare for a long time, which is increased resilience to shocks. And this is something which was a very vague and generic concept until we found ourselves in the middle of a global pandemic. And I think, Roger, you said it very well. No one thought that food availability information was going to be so critical. The actual availability of food hasn't proven to be an issue. It's the perception and supply chain disruptions and volatility which have been absolutely the most difficult, and particularly for governments to make decisions and for smallholder farmers. And so the framing for us at AGRA has been not just to issue monthly reports, which are available on our website. If any of you are interested, we issue 2 monthly reports. One is a COVID update for the countries in Africa for which we have information. And the other is a food security monitor, which is both about regional food trade availability and trends of food productivity, as well as shocks in the system, which we've been seeing with the locusts, as well as some floods in areas, and of course, dry seasons and others. And what we've also seen and launched this year has been a survey of impacts on the private sector. And particularly, we started out by surveying women entrepreneurs, and have seen the impact on women entrepreneurs is incredibly sensitive, incredibly high. 40% of the 100 women entrepreneurs for which we surveyed in June were at risk of either completely shutting down their businesses, no cash flow, or having to completely pivot their businesses. But even more than that, 75% or so of them were actually pivoting the business and using digital tools. And so we were very pleased, and this question has been coming up again and again: to what degree are people in Africa, from village level to business level, ready and able to actually use digital technologies? So we had actually preempted this in several ways last year and this year with a digital agricultural strategy, which we had put together, along with engagement around, and I was going to share some slides on this, but for some reason my screen is not showing the slides that I wanted to show, but other slides. So I'm not going to show you the wrong slides, which of course would confuse everybody. But we have also been working here. Can you see these? Inclusive agricultural transformation has been really the topic that we've focused on. Roger, are these coming through okay?
Yes, Vanessa, we can see them now.
Okay, great. So our teams have been so actively looking at what are the variables towards ag transformation, and this is in light of generic shocks, which have been in the system and have been known, compounded, of course, by the COVID shocks. And so we took a deep dive recently into the shocks around markets and market systems. And Roger, this is to what you and I were talking about a bit earlier. What has to happen is increased predictability and, of course, diversification of income streams. And these are things that everyone has been talking about in terms of ag economics, in terms of even individual performance of businesses, as you know very well. And so why are we continuing to not deliver on improving the supply chains, improving the end-to-end linkages? And a lot of our teams have worked on three pillars of making those improvements, which are described here. One pillar being at the farm level, another pillar being in terms of linkages and partnerships and improved systems for markets. And then the final one, of course, is relative to the government and policy constraints. And this is one of my favorite slides because it really speaks to how to connect from end to end in those supply chains. And we've used the village advisors or village agripreneurs and as a way of mobilizing youth, linking smallholder farmers who are increasingly sensitive to these shocks due to climate volatility as well as market volatility, and of course now health and safety pandemic issues. And so through the survey we have done with CEOs of 180 or so companies across Africa, and we just published this fantastic report yesterday, which is about the outlook of agribusinesses in Africa. And we looked at 10 priority areas for the private sector, which they say, and again, you can see the sophisticated rating system that KPMG put together to prioritize key areas for focus and how to move forward. Finance, investment come through in every way here, but also technologies and government commitment. And so through this perspective, the team actually put together and published some nice recommendations, which are impossible to read on this tiny text, but which we think really do bring the pieces together. And again, digital, and this is our digital vision, is one of the keys, and in the use of digital technology to be much more inclusive in the ag transformation journey and reducing food insecurity. So these are the few points which I thought would come and illustrate our conversation, and for which we have, as I mentioned, on our website, a number of publications which we have been making available over the past few months as COVID has been reducing mobility, that we figure rather than convening a lot of meetings physically in person, now we're become very adept at relaying this information virtually to those who can access it. So with that, Roger, I'll hand back to you, and I'm happy to take questions in the chat or send links to the various documents which I've referenced to. Thanks, over to you.
Vanessa, thanks. Okay, I've got a conceptual PowerPoint. So imagine that I've got up on the screen a picture of a funnel. And at the top of the funnel are government policies, and at the bottom of the funnel is what's happening on the farm. So in essence, it's exactly what Vanessa said, but I've got a conceptual PowerPoint versus the real one. So let's start at the top of the funnel, because Vanessa, you said it well. What are the government policies and regional trade policies which can have a direct impact on food supply? I'll give you an example. Ghana, for example, imports 600,000 metric tons of rice on an annual basis. Back to the issue of supply chain vulnerability, national policy, and I know this is something that they're working on in Ghana, is rice self-sufficiency. Why is that important? It's quite easy because, frankly, if the supply chain breaks down, if you're sourcing domestically, you've gotten rid of one of your points of vulnerability. Also at the top is something that I'll call sort of an end buyer analysis. And just to digress for a minute, as I was thinking about the session today, I've been involved with many, many different aspects of ag from both the macro to the micro. So what I thought I would do is really simply come up with a shopping list of the vulnerabilities and the areas where we can proactively begin to think about what we need to do in anticipation for any kind of shock or crisis such as with what we've just seen. So back to the funnel. We've got the importance of domestic self-sufficiency. We need to look at government policies. And secondly, something that you don't hear much about, but let's do some end buyer analysis. Are you growing for local markets? Are you growing for regional markets? Are you growing for international markets? If you're selling to international markets, are you selling high-end value-added products, ones that could potentially be vulnerable if there's any kind of reduction in demand? Is it regional? If it's regional, how are the products actually being transported and what are the vulnerabilities? In other words, you almost have to think, I'm going to lose customers. Who are they and where am I most vulnerable? Moving down through the funnel is really what is critical is a value chain approach. We all know the concept of the farm to the fork, but there are a lot of pieces along the way. So if you're a rice farmer, is the gap finance for equipment? Is it access to equipment? Is it storage? Is it transport? In other words, to take a value chain analysis and think where in particular, based on each product, each crop you're growing, are there vulnerabilities? Also on sort of the middle of the funnel is what I'm calling coordinated production versus subsistence. If you've got a group of farmers in one region and everybody's just a subsistence farmer, there's no way that you're going to be able to create any kind of economic livelihoods outside of what you're growing, in your respective gardens versus trying to link up with markets. This is hardly a concept unique to COVID, but the urgency of coordinated production so that you can tap into bigger buyers is absolutely critical. As we continue to move down the funnel, technology can play a critical role. And when I talk about technology, I just don't mean digitization, but there are many other parts of the solution. Mechanization is a very simple solution on one hand, but incredibly complicated when you begin to think about the type of equipment that's needed. Even something as simple as a walk-behind tractor can dramatically improve production. Other aspects of the technology, what's happening in the soil. I've been doing a lot of work, for example, with microbes, and to introduce microbes as an organic fertilizer and pesticide can dramatically improve yields as well as shelf life. And shelf life in the light of COVID becomes increasingly important. Monitoring, many kinds of monitoring equipment. And if you could identify diseases, as you potentially can through aerial photography and infrared photography, before the diseases are apparent on the plant, is another solution. So we need to think about the technology solutions, the appropriate technology solutions, and what does a suite of those solutions actually begin to look like. Drilling down even more, let's go to the crop level. As an example, I love tomatoes, I grow tomatoes, I spend a lot of time talking to tomato farmers, but they're a lousy crop in light of COVID. Root vegetables, on the other hand, have more nutritious quality and much, much better shelf life. So to really drill down, the issue of crop selection, both in terms of the nutritional qualities, as well as the ability of the crop to actually stay on the shelf or be stored, is critically important. I mentioned earlier value chain, but storage, absolutely critical. We all know the story of increased storage enables the farmers to make income long after the harvest season. But in light of COVID, it's increasingly important. You look at many of the humanitarian disasters that we've seen over the centuries, and one of the biggest problems is not getting food to the people who are most desperate for it, but it's having appropriate storage facilities so that the food can be used over time. In light of COVID or any other shocks, there's an increasing need to make sure that there's storage equipment of all types. And lastly, on my shopping list here, as we go down the funnel at the very bottom, is to think about water as a scarce resource. If we run into the kind of serious problems that we've seen, we all know the importance of food and water, but frankly, food is higher up in the value chain or in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So what are your sources of water? Where are you vulnerable? How can you prepare? So that, in essence, is what I'll call my funnel-type COVID preparatory kit, which really integrates the most macro kind of policy issues on the government level, all the way down to crop selection, to get water to water whatever it is you're growing. Let me pause there and see if there might be questions coming in from the chat, or Vanessa, maybe you and I can compare notes on what we've learned and where the opportunities and what some of the failings are.
Yeah, and Roger, I love your shopping list. One, because I love to shop, but two, because I do think that your shopping list matters to a lot of people. It matters because it's really, in the end, and we all know this, in order for the transformation of agriculture food systems, as we're going into the Food Systems Summit in 2021, and this is another area that we're actively involved in, there's a huge change in what is known in terms of science and what's needed. And so the traditional answers and approaches towards ag transformation have to be infused with new measurements about carbon capture and carbon sequestration. In terms of, you give the tomato example, and I was on another panel this week where tomatoes are one of the holy grails, like poultry in Africa. Why aren't we growing more, processing more, and supplying the huge demand for tomato paste on the continent? Huge opportunity for investment. Just like poultry transformation and rice transformation, these are flagship multi-stakeholder investment opportunities. And in the recent agribusiness deal room, which we facilitated in September, we looked at some of these flagships with governments of different countries around the continent. In fact, 19 countries presented their flagships for investment in their priority areas. And there was a recurring theme, which you've underscored, which is value capture and increasing the availability and the quality of, and the and how shall I say, more competitive pricing to consumers on the continent, right? And so this is what are some of the key ingredients to the new norm, building back better. Nobody wants to return backwards to pre-COVID food systems and agri-food systems and investments. So I think we're really looking to the investment, the financial service providers, the DFIs, and the development partners in the communities to think differently about how we catalyze growth. And I see a lot of private sector partners and companies online that we work with around the continent who know so well that this, just if we talk about mechanization, efficiency of farming, land utilization, when I meet with the experts and the scientists around climate adaptation and climate change mitigation, the number one thing that I've heard is don't increase the land size the land area under cultivation. Efficiency and productivity is where we want to be investing and growing going forward. And this is something that we know inherently, but doing it, of course, and getting there is as you've described, it really does take an integrated approach. But someone has to take the first risky investment, first stage, be the front runner, the mover. And some people have said that there are first mover advantages in this COVID crisis. Even last night, I went to a brand new restaurant that just opened in the middle of COVID when nobody is, thinking about opening anything. And we said, well, what are you doing? It's a beautiful outdoor terrace restaurant where they said, okay, we're going to do a restaurant with no walls. That way you're protected, and why not? So I think that we have a really dynamic group in the audience. I've put 4 different links in the chat for those of you who are used to this system, where you can go and see some of the various platforms that at AGRA we're trying to make more available to match SMEs, to profile entrepreneurs, but also provide evidence and data so that decision making can be facilitated. What do you think, Roger?
Vanessa, that was terrific. It occurs to me, I've been thinking about, what are the dangers? And the most dangerous thing is really a mindset. I'll use an evil word. It's called silos. Point being that I think both Vanessa and I are speaking about an integrated approach. And, historically, you begin to think about, a mindset of this is what I do and I'm not thinking outside the box. It's extremely dangerous. I've worked with the issues around health. And the gap and the lack of a connection between protein and health is something that just a lot of people are not thinking about as much as they really need to. So you begin to think about, integrating these things. What does that mean? Because why are we growing all this food? We want healthy people. But what are the other aspects of health? So to think creatively and to think horizontally as well as vertically is critical, because the old systems, as we've seen, are just broken, period. And we have a lot of new solutions. And, to your point, Vanessa, as well, I mean, I think it's terrific that a lot of the DFIs and governments are thinking about these things. But, it's been my experience, having been on the front lines, that the private sector moves a little faster, just historically, is a little bit more adaptable. So I think these solutions are not going to come necessarily from the sort of DFI development community as alone. But we all know PPPs and partnerships. Critical that we stop talking about it and really begin to determine what are these partnerships that will make us more resilient? What are the partnerships that will create the economic opportunities that will attract capital? Because there's a tremendous, tremendous need. You look at mechanization alone, an area where I've done a lot of work over the years. There's a voracious need for funding. There's a voracious need for equipment. We've got to get rid of the hoe. We have, back to Vanessa's point, even the slightest of technology interventions can make a dramatic difference. So, back to the funnel, we need to think up and down, vertically, horizontally, and all get out of our silos. At the end of the day, even on the commercial side, when I run into people, they say, are you concerned about competition? Well, I mean, competition, respectfully, a lot of these solutions are being implemented in such small scale, it's barely the mosquito on the back of an elephant. And we begin to think about the voracious need for funding. We need to think about the voracious need for equipment, for food, for innovation. We're all going to be very busy for a very, very long time.
It's interesting. I really do come from the private sector. I've been accused of being a bureaucrat. It's definitely not true. I'd like to just put that on record. But I do really see this constant dance between the private sector who have capital but are risk averse, and the private sector who are ready to take risks and wanting to try to venture into new sources of protein, health-based foods, improved and higher tech technologies. And it's fascinating always. I was in a room full of philanthropists also a few years ago saying they couldn't find a good business plan to invest in. And I wanted to pull my hair out because I see fantastic business plans all the time, but they're not traditional. They don't fit the traditional criteria. And so, for example, the business plans I see have a longer payback period. Let's talk about tree crops, right? If we looked at the risk to the coffee supply chain with climate volatility, and yet the industry is continuing to grow, but smallholder farmers growing coffee still are in the food security at risk areas. Why? Because their land size is too small and their yields are too low. And yet Africa has some of the best coffee in the world, hands down. And those who are focused on cash crops, like poultry or maize, or sorghum are also looking, the staple crops are looking at the cash crops with, dreamy eyes. The holy grail is having cash crops, and horticulture, that'll be the answer. Let's do high value horticulture, which uses less land, and can also yield much higher values, right? And so there at a macro level, we can have that conversation and make decisions, but at a micro level in rural Mali, you don't get to choose between growing, high value horticulture necessarily, and sorghum. You grow whatever you have seeds on hand for, you grow whatever you need to eat, and you just pray it's going to rain. And so, for example, insurance, crop insurance is available in East Africa and Southern Africa. It's not very widely available in West Africa, in the Sahelian countries. Or if it is, it's extremely expensive relative to the farmer income levels. So we do continue to have challenges, and I think we have to look for balancing the risk portfolio so that those who have innovative ideas and higher risk models find some of the more institutional risk mitigation tools that risk averse companies, who can grow but may not be willing to take a lower profit margin or a longer term return on investment. So these are the trade-offs, I think.
Great, Vanessa. I see there are a couple of questions coming up in the chat screen. So, views on the effect of COVID-19 turbulence on purchasing power. Clearly a macroeconomic question. We've seen economies decimated and buying power is just cut across the board. As to the impact on meat consumption, more expensive foods are not going to be consumed as much, period. This is hardly unique to Africa. This is more of a macroeconomic concern. I don't know if there are other questions coming through. I know we just have a minute or two, but Vanessa, maybe some last comments as I'm not seeing any questions, and then I'll do the same.
Absolutely. My 2 or 3 last comments. One is, let's do more together. Let's co-invest. Let's partner for last mile solutions which are sustainable. I think that there, as you said, the private sector really is the way towards transformation, but there has to be a few risk mitigation and policy and regulatory support. And I do think leadership really does matter. And if we can unify the voice of the private sector towards the leadership in Africa, the time is now. There's a huge opportunity and appetite for what to do to build back better. So open to all inputs and looking forward to hearing from everyone.
Good, and I think I would sum it up in 2 words. Think holistically, think creatively. Back to the funnel example, we need to think through the funnel on the most macro solutions as well as the micro, and think creatively because we know what's happened in the past is not working, so there's a lot of room for improvement. And with that, I see it's promptly the end of the hour. So let me just wrap things up by saying thank you everyone for joining. And I think our emails are easily available if you have follow-up questions. So, and that concludes our session. So,
thanks, Roger.
Bye, everyone. Thanks all.
Joining.
So I think we'll stick around for another moment or two if there are questions on the chat screen. But I do want to be respectful of the next session coming up now. So if you do have those questions.
Thanks to Gert and the African Agri Council, really, you've done a great job putting all of this together. So I don't think we've recognized you enough.
Good call. Good. We're just hanging out, looking at the chat screen as question comes up. So that ends the official part of the session.
Thanks to you, Cindy, and we're trying to be profound. We appreciate that, and that.
Yeah.
All right. So we're going to the next session. Thanks, Bruce. Good to see you join.
Thanks all. Okay, Vanessa, I'm seeing 10:32. I think we're good.
I think we still have 18 people with us, which is quite impressive because there's
Oh,
another session that seems to be starting, but I'm not sure if everyone knows how to join the next session. But
yeah, and
we'll all be migrating into the next session, but I think it may be a VIP or invitation only. So,
so
right.
good. And if there are other questions, as I say, we'll stick around for another few minutes if any last minute thoughts. Good. Well, my only request is if anybody has a good recipe for Spam, I have way too much of this stuff. So I'm open to suggestions. It's my ultimate COVID-19 fallback food.
Are you from Hawaii? You know that's a national food in Hawaii. That's where I grew up.
No, I don't.
Right?
I had no idea.
Oh, you should look it up. Look at Hawaii and Spam. You'll see like 25 recipes.
Perfect. Just what I need, just in case.
All right. And it came from World War II, by the way, food security, shelf life.
Oh, yeah. Give it to the soldiers. So good. I think we're good here. I'm not seeing any more questions. So Vanessa, it's really been a pleasure. I'll give you a call later today. I'm going to catch a few more Z's. It's a little bit early in the morning here.
I'm
So
sure it is. Well, enjoy the remainder of your rest, and we'll look forward to catching up soon, Roger.
I do as well. I look forward to it as well. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it. Appreciate your kind words on the session.